Hi, I'm Nathan,
And I'm Dan.
and we are DKNG Studios, and we're here today with another one of our deep dives. This time we're going even deeper. In addition to talking through the process video and kind of narrating our process, we're also going to take a look at what happens before we dive into the computer in the sketching phase, and then also what happens afterwards when we make separations. But in this case, we're talking about our recent Dave Matthews Band poster that we did for their show at Madison Square Garden in New York City. And this poster actually started life as a diptych, which is why in the sketch here you can see that there were actually going to be two different posters split in half. In the end, it ended up being a single poster, but that's
Mhm.
kind of where the composition started. And I guess we can kind of talk through a little bit about our concepting for this and how we came up with this idea, because we always want to have kind of a sense of location, but
Mhm.
also do something fun that relates to the artist.
Yeah, diptychs are always a fun exercise for us because usually the reason why we approach diptychs is because there's two nights for the same concert, which was the case for this concert series. So when we originally pitched this to Dave Matthews Band, we thought rather than making one poster, let's see if they'd be into this diptych idea. And this whole sketch is kind of representing two different nights, but it could also be cut down the middle and turned into two different posters. So if you were a person that went to night one and you're just interested in the night one poster, you can actually buy that separately. And it's really cool with like the screen printing process too, because you could actually have it printed all together and not cut it down. And it's kind of like another collector's piece in itself. So there's a lot going on with the whole concept of diptychs. For this particular project, though, it actually ended up being a single poster representing both nights, which we'll show a bit later.
Concept wise, the band recently released an album called Walk Around the Moon. So we thought, maybe we can literally fuse that idea of kind of walking in space, walking on the moon, with the idea of where the show is taking place in New York City and the Brooklyn Bridge. So the idea
Mhm.
we settled on, I think originally we had talked about just doing the bridge and then thought, why don't we set it in outer space just to add even more meaning and context to it? So we kind of landed on this idea of an astronaut couple hand in hand walking in this kind of outer spacescape version of the
Mhm.
Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah, we had some fun with kind of making the bridge on its own like a little bit more unique than your standard Brooklyn Bridge, and playing around with different colors and like elongating its shape. And the idea with this was kind of to make it otherworldly and kind of play around with like what would a Brooklyn Bridge esque bridge look like on the moon. So this is kind of where concept is really fun, where we can kind of push the limits of reality a little bit and play around with how this would look in sketch form. And speaking of the sketch, we also have a lot of fun with making this on the iPad specifically because it can be in color. Um, we get to play around with like trying to figure out more or less the problem solving ahead of time of how many are going to be printed for screen printing. So not only does it kind of help with concept, but it kind of helps plan out like how this is going to be made as a screen print.
Yeah, so with that, we had this sketch approved. We had a nice roadmap ahead for what we're going to be doing when we jump into the computer. So now we can go take a look at the process video and talk about what happens after the sketch is approved. So now we're taking a look at the process video, and this is basically a time lapse covering the entire process of making this poster once we get into the computer. So you'll see that sketch making an appearance here. We kind of ghost that a bit in the background so we have something to work from, and also pulling in our photo reference of actual elements like the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yep. And like we said before, this ended up being a single poster representing both nights. So we kind of took a portion of our sketch and utilized that as like the main element and brought it into um, a portrait, version of the poster. So no longer is it landscape and long; it's actually tall and narrow, which
Which
actually
is
kind of worked
interesting.
out nicely because it's the poster itself, the bridge itself, is actually pretty tall. So it actually ended up prioritizing the shape of the bridge a lot more.
But it's funny because the final poster is a landscape composition. So
That's true.
if you remember, we actually, I think, you're even having the same instinct now where
Yep.
you thought like, oh, we're just doing a single, let's make it portrait. But then we kind of looked again and we're like, oh, we want to show like this big landscape of the sky and all the cables coming off the bridge. So it'll be interesting to see at what point in this process we transition back to the landscape format.
Yeah, yeah, it's actually kind of hilarious that you bring this up because we had this conversation exactly as you're hearing it
Yeah.
when I was making it. I was like, "Oh, here's a draft of where I'm at," and Nathan's like, "I think uh, let's go back to horizontal. It would actually look better because we can see like more skyline. We could see more of the cables from the bridge, and it actually ended up switching. So even though like this is starting off this way, it does change down the line. So I apologize for eluding everyone into thinking it's going to be a portrait mode.
Well, it's good insight into seeing our process in real
Yeah,
time.
for sure.
Um, so let's talk about these textures that are going in. That you're kind of constructing the main shape of the bridge and the arches, but then
Yeah.
also in addition to solid color bases, there's this kind of grainy texture going in. And I think this is actually one of the first posters we did where rather than applying this style of grainy mezzotint, warmy texture, whatever you want to call it, applying it natively in Illustrator versus waiting to do it at the end.
Yeah. So we did post a video on how we create this actual texture on YouTube, and it's completely using raster effects within Illustrator, and it's very flexible and editable, like where you could actually like move around this gradient, and it would re-rasterize and make those shapes as you go. So for most part, it's kind of like this gradient that's being used that ends up looking grainy that I can kind of drop in as a colorized clipping mask, kind of an additive thing that I add on top of solid shapes. So as this is being created, you're kind of seeing solid shape go down and then one more layer of color that kind of represent like shadow or highlight using that actual grain texture. And like I just said, the grain is actually made um, using a couple effects, and we actually have a video on exactly how that's done step by step through YouTube. So if you check it out, it's one of our recent grain videos.
Yeah, I think we can actually link to that here.
Yep.
Um, and then, yeah, I guess we should kind of talk also about the three dimensionality going on here of creating these cables. And I feel like
Yeah.
this is using some tools we don't often use as far as adding depth like this.
Yeah, this is a tough one. It's like there's probably some perfect math to be made here, but the idea is to kind of create uh, this look of um, things getting tighter as they go past into the distance. And I think there probably is a way to mathematically get this perfect, but one quick and easy way to kind of get that look is to create a series of lines and then use the 3D tool to force it to be in a perspective. And the more you tweak that perspective, the tighter it gets as you go into the distance. And I kind of just like played around with doing it to a point where it visually looked normal, and adjusted from there. So it's kind of a hit or miss kind of guessing game. But one interesting thing about this poster is it is in fact using like a horizon line and perspective beyond what you're seeing on like the bridge body itself. So anything that's considered like the ground or these cables is kind of taking that into consideration. So you can kind of see it's kind of an experiment at this point, but then as we go forward, you can start to see some of these guidelines that are being utilized, and trying to stick within that rule of like what is the horizon line, what is the perspective throughout this poster.
Cool. Um, One thing I was also noticing to mention is this poster already has some kind of placeholder text for the band name there,
Yeah.
and I was just going to mention like how we typically work together. That we collaborate on everything, but while you're kind of focusing on the illustration, I might be working on the typography, and then
Yep.
kind of passing things back and forth as we go. So I think this was kind of like an early rough version of the type we wanted to use. So it's kind of serving as a placeholder here, and we'll see that get updated as we go. But it's kind of helpful to start seeing more and more of the building blocks in place. So we're slowly but surely combining our efforts and getting closer to a final.
Yeah, for sure. Nathan, I think you kind of went through several iterations and
Yeah.
when it comes to the type, and even stuff we're not going to see in this process video too, where the experimentation's kind of done behind the scenes, and you're kind of utilizing an existing typeface, but you really just went all out when it came to customizing it and getting all the letters to kind of interact in more interesting ways. And more often than not, it's like kind of tweaking things to the point where it's like really customized and then kind of pulling back, I notice, as like we go along, because it also has to do with like legibility and making sure that it's a quick read. And so oftentimes we kind of resort to more simple the better, but at the same time, like at least being able to visually see what it looks like as customized as possible as a starting point.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking a lot recently about this idea of like over designing, and maybe you
Hmm.
shouldn't do something just because you can. And
Yep.
it's like, yeah, I think with lettering, it's a good example of you could um, put swashes or a detail on every single letter, but why
Yeah.
do that? It's just going to be overkill. So, yeah, I think it's like looking at all the letters that have been given to you for whatever the project is, and then deciding which ones should I prioritize to keep this interesting but also legible. So it's kind of like a puzzle every time you're presented with a name or a word. And sometimes you hit the jackpot and all those letters interact and lock into each other really nicely. And sometimes you have really weird collisions going on.
For
But
sure.
it's kind of a
Yeah.
fun challenge each time.
Well,
Um,
speaking of over designing, my version of that is like making things look too hyper realistic when there's probably a built-in style guide that we've already established. And I think when it came to drawing these people or drawing the planets, I could go like to the point of like, oh my gosh, it looks almost like a photo. But since the established design, styles have already been kind of there for the bridge, the kind of constant reminder was like basic shapes, and then use texture as kind of like an only necessary additive thing rather than like something that we depend on. And so
yeah,
you can kind of see like these people end up being pretty simple in structure. And the only times we're really using like lighting and shadow is when it's necessary. So it's like there's a light source for making sure that like, it's beaming on the sides, and maybe there's a bit of a shadow when it comes to their backpacks, but kind of leaving it at that, not going crazy with it. And
yeah, I think this planet that you're now, I think, kind of recreating was part of that discussion of the first time you made it the gradients were very prominent. So kind of
mhm.
that flat shape plus introduction of texture got even more detailed with the gradient going on here. And I think at first I was kind of like, oh, maybe instead of a gradient, we want it to be more like have solid chunks of where the highlight and shadow differentiate. So it kind of
Yep.
matches how the bridge has like really stark highlights and shadows. So yeah,
Yep.
here's that idea coming together where the highlight is like there's a clear divider equator line there rather than a gentle blend from the light side to the dark side. So
For
yeah, I think that
sure.
totally helped unify the style a lot.
Yeah, there's something to be said about like, well, first off, like just from a technical standpoint, things in the background should technically be more simple because
Mhm.
you really want the eye to focus on the main imagery, which is the people, the bridge, and then it kind of feels like the planets should be more of like a secondary read. So if I was going to put all my energy into these planets, then it kind of created an imbalance visually.
Yeah.
Um, but another thing that we try to do too is like utilize the ink colors in really interesting ways when it comes to like midtones and shadows. So like the shadow version of teal steps down to using navy, and going up, like we can like kind of create that illusion of shadow and highlight with actually not depending on texture at all. And so we kind of did a combination of like graphic flat look meets sandiness, and the sandiness is kind of more of like a added feature rather than like something we depended on.
Yeah, and I kind of like in that example that we were just going past here with the bridge, how you do have both the effect of like the highlight and shadow of the yellow face of the column and then the navy
Hmm.
side, but then even within like the angled part of it, you have the gradient being created by the grain pattern, showing
Yeah,
you that it's at that kind of 45. So as simple as we're saying that this is, there is a lot of subtlety in making all these decisions of, is it a harsh shadow or more of like a gentle one being created with the grain? But it's kind of nice that we have those two tools in our toolkit for this poster. You can either create highlight and shadow with solid shapes, or you can create it with some version of the grain, even creating a gradient within itself. So there's still like a lot of options, even within this very strict set of rules for this poster.
for sure. As we're kind of scrolling through some of these close-up shots, this is actual photography of the actual screen prints. And one thing to note here is that two different versions were made too. So uh, when the poster is all done and said, and when it comes to the design, we can have a lot of fun with color updates and kind of making a completely different variant. And in addition to that, choosing a completely different paper. So what we're seeing here is a the variant, which is actually on foil paper. It's like a rainbow holographic foil. So it's very hard to photograph, but you can kind of see that like it has kind of like a mirror finish to it.
Yeah. So here's that the main edition that had the biggest run, was this kind of yellow and teal combo with navy. This is a three color poster, and we'll show you the separations after this. And then I think here we'll transition to the foil, which, yeah, as Dan mentioned, is really hard to photograph the foil because it's like trying to take a picture of a mirror. You're just taking a
Yep,
picture of yourself at that point. So
exactly.
this is kind of like our fake mock-up, trying to get as close as possible with what that foil could look like. But obviously, it looks different in every environment, which is also the fun of hanging it on your walls. It's going to look different in the morning than it does at night. Um,
For
and
sure.
then also here's a look at the updated text and where we landed with that. And as you can see, it's a bit more refined than the original, like with the gradient included and also the shadow of how some of the parts of the letters overlap or intertwine with each other. So
Yeah.
that was fun. Um, yeah, so that's kind of the project. But now let's take a look at the actual print separations and how this comes together. So now we're taking a look at the actual separations that were used to print this poster. So, even though this is obviously drawn in a more intuitive way, drawing each object and shape in Illustrator, when this actually comes together for printing, each color needs to go down on its own. So, in this case, we're dealing with this main edition. The first color that went down was the yellow ink, which you can see that separation here. That was followed by this teal layer, and then lastly, this navy blue. And as you can see, kind of get a whole variety of how these interact with each other. So a huge part of the project that we don't often touch on in our process videos is this whole post-production aspect. And
Yeah.
once the band or the client approves the artwork, we're kind of only maybe 70% of the way done. And that last chunk of 30% is getting the files ready to screen print in the best way possible. So we try to take a lot of time and care in how these get layered in order to make sure they turn out nice and print as cleanly as possible.
For sure. Yeah. And um, it's very typical to see color going down this way too, like seeing it go from light to dark. It's the easiest thing to digest when it comes to layering because darker colors are going to mask the color underneath it and trap it in a really clean way. Whereas if you went the opposite route, especially if like a lighter color is a little bit transparent, you're going to see through it a little bit, and you're going to get a little bit of like a interaction of both colors combining. Um, and one thing to kind of note when it comes to like color mixing too, like Nathan and I started our career kind of doing both the design, illustration, and the screen printing of our work. So we kind of have a bit of a background of like understanding how this works. So it really helps having that that knowledge to then create separations and understand like the best way for this to be separated for a professional screen printer. And you can kind of see as Nathan's like playing around with the opacity of these different layers, how they interact. And you can see there's a bit of an overlap with everything. And that is essentially the world of trapping, which is basically making sure that if there is a misregistration, that you're not seeing these little slivers of paper or white kind of peeking through. And just like everything else, like this is a hand done process that's done with like actual manual labor, and things can kind of shift here and there. So like it's basically providing more of a foolproof system of when these layers go down one by one, the poster is more intended to look as perfect as we can. So like Nathan's kind of showing like when something does misregister, you can see how much of a push and pull we have. And just having that trapping there, if it moves around just like a quarter or sorry, an eighth of an inch or whatever, we still have a little bit of like wiggle room there.
Yeah. So if we didn't have any trapping and this, teal layer moved just ever so slightly to the side, we would see a sliver of white immediately. But the fact that we
Yeah.
have a little bit built in, there is that play before we get to this point where, something might draw your eye. And obviously it looks really obvious now because I have all these layers turned down to 50% opacity. But once it's at 100, you should really never notice if things shift a little bit because that trapping is protecting us. So
Yep.
when you're first getting into the world of trapping, it's really hard to wrap your mind around because it's there, but it will never be. If we do it correctly, it'll be never be visible to the naked eye. So that's kind of hard to get used to when you first start thinking about it. But I think the easiest way is to start looking at things transparent with some transparency, and then you start to learn what's going on there.
Yeah.
But
This is probably the reason why we don't show this process very often, because as I'm hearing us talk about it, it just sounds really, really technical and kind of nerdy. But we've also gotten on a lot of requests on how this is done. So here it is. It's, the non-sexy version of our work is spending a lot of time on a design after it's done being designed and basically getting it print ready. And oftentimes, like, we could spend like a week working on a design, but it could take like 2 or 3 days just getting it trapped and separated. So
yeah,
it's a huge part of our job.
here's an example of I guess some other like trapping terminology we could talk about is usually the last color to go down is the darkest. Not always. Sometimes you go like reverse order if you're printing on dark paper or something. But in this case, this darker navy blue is kind of acting as our key line and kind
Yep.
of like outlining everything. If you think about like comic book art, that last kind of like dark outline that goes around all the illustrations. So here, if you look, with just the first two layers down, um, everything looks pretty strange because you're kind of seeing a lot of shapes that are bigger or more expanded than they're going to be in the final. And then once that final key line goes down, that's what really kind of sucks everything into its final size. So, for example, with this lettering is a good example of we actually have a little stroke around it to help protect its legibility from all this texture going
Hmm.
on. And again, I'll bump this back up to the full transparency. So you can see at the end, it's pretty subtle. You can't really tell that there's a stroke there. But when you kind of view this booth, at the merch booth at the end of the night, and you've had a few beers at the show and you're taking this in, should look pretty damn clean. And
Yeah.
hopefully you won't notice all those little tricks that we did to make it look clean.
Yeah. That technique we're seeing too, where the color behind it is a little bit more pushed back a little bit. The term we typically use is choking it back. So it's kind of like the reverse of adding more things on top of a layer. It's kind of like taking the layer behind it and showing less of it so that the layer on top of it can actually mask it in a really clean way. And so that's really comes in handy when it comes to text and legibility, especially when it comes to like fine details. Choking back is the way to go. And the nice thing about this whole like darker color at the end too is that it really overlays both yellow and teal in a lot of different ways. So like in the sky, it's basically got a whole background full of teal. And it has a different interaction with that where if, like we said in the beginning of this, screen printing is an imperfect process where like a little bit of dust might fall on top of a screen and poke some holes into it. At least we know that if that happens, a little like piece of hole pushed into that navy is going to only reveal teal behind it versus like showing through the paper. So layering is really helpful when it comes to cleanliness as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. That if you think about like from a screen printing perspective, and when we used to do it ourselves quite a bit, just trying to print a solid field of color was the most difficult thing.
Yeah.
And that's why I think like a lot of screen printed posters you see do have a certain amount of grit or distressing or something going on to protect the printing process from those kinds of issues. So yeah, it's a really delicate process. So if you ever do see something like a Jason Munn small stakes poster that just has a big field of solid color that
Yeah.
doesn't have any pinholes poked in it, you know that that was a really excellent printer that is basically working in a clean room in order to
Hmm.
avoid those little pinhole issues. So
Very Walter White of screen printing kind of screen printers.
exactly.
Even after the fact, like if you see like a little dot on a poster, like really good detail oriented screen printers will go in with like a little paintbrush with that ink and kind of cover it up really quick. So there's ways of fixing it at the end. It's kind of like painting, but you know nowadays with like a really clean environment and these automatic presses, we can get a pretty clean looking poster. And I mean, the whole point of it is to look a bit more hand done anyway. So this is why we like to work with texture too. Is it's kind of allows for a more forgiving process. And if we see holes poked into this, it's not a big deal.
Um, Speaking of that kind of like Walter White lab like environment, another reason why trapping is important is because sometimes the humidity conditions can change in a print shop. So
Yeah.
paper will be, it's this organic substance, it'll expand and contract. So that trapping is also protecting us from if the paper does move a bit between printing the different colors. This isn't like printing a t-shirt where if you've ever seen like a screen printing t-shirt carousel where it's just spinning around and it's like color after color after color. You might print a poster like this in a period of 3 days where you print the yellow, rack it,
Yep.
let it dry for a day, then come back to the teal. So humidity control is kind of a big part of this as well. So yeah, for something as simple as printing a poster, a lot goes into it.
Yeah. Really good screen printers will acclimate the paper to the environment prior to even printing. So let's say this is an edition of 100, they'll individually have all those pieces of paper sitting in racks blank for like the night. And then they get acclimated to the environment inside their studio and absorb any sort of like, moisture in the air so that when they are screen printed, there's no shape shifting of the poster paper itself. So each layer that goes down is more expected. Whereas like we've seen the other side of that where things kind of shrink and expand, and it almost looks like both layers of colors going down were done by basically shrinking the art itself, and everything gets misaligned. And that's kind of like a trial and error when it comes to screen printing itself. And we're glad we work with the pros where they avoid that. But especially the nicer the paper, the more delicate the process and the prep that it takes.
Well, I think we've sufficiently did a thorough deep dive into the nerdiest parts of screen printing.
Absolutely.
So hope you enjoyed our deep dive into this poster. Unfortunately, this one is already all sold out, but we hope to have more Dave Matthews and other poster projects coming up in the future. So definitely check out the other videos, including that tutorial about how to do the grain texture in this poster. And we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.